This worksheet looks at uses of ionising radiation. So far, we've looked at what ionising radiation is, what they're made of. We've looked at how dangerous they can be. And this worksheet looks at how useful they can be, where we use them. Don't forget, it's really, really important you have a go at the worksheet first, and then use this video if you're stuck. If you look at an answer and say, oh yes, I knew that, it's completely different and you don't know that you've learnt it. If you had a go and you've nearly got it right, that's completely different. So do the worksheet first, and then use this video to help you. Don't forget, you can ask the question asker at any time, and that will send me an email. That'll send an email straight to me. Question number 1. The most ionising radiation is alpha. That's because it's relatively big and it does a lot of damage whenever it hits an atom. So it's much more likely to take away those outer electrons if it hits an atom. Question 2. The most penetrating is gamma. Don't forget, gamma is a high energy wave and it goes through most things. Question 3. What type of radiation has the longest range in air? That's gamma. Gamma can go through a lot of stuff and it won't be affected by air that much. Alpha is only a few centimeters in air, and beta, I'm guessing, is a few meters. The next section is on smoke alarms. If you have a look at that diagram, you can see that there is a radioactive source at the bottom called americium. Now that's an alpha source, and then there's these two plates that are connected to some sort of circuit. So at the moment, without anything flowing there, that electrical circuit cannot work because there is a gap in between those plates and there's no circuit connected. The radioactive substance at the bottom, that is fired across the plates and that ionises the air. This is really useful because those air ions then split into positives and negatives. If they're attracted to each side of the plate, the opposite charge plate, then that will allow the current to flow. And as long as there's a current flowing, the detector can know that, and then it knows everything's fine. As soon as there's a break between those plates, say some large smoke particles went in the way and stopped the air being ionized, then it won't allow the current to flow, and then the buzzer will sound. Okay, question number 4. What type of ionizing radiation is used in the smoke alarm above? That is alpha radiation. This is because it's the most ionizing, and that will allow a lot of the ions in the air to be ionized, and that will allow the current to flow. Question number 5. Explain how the ionizing radiation is used to make current flow in the circuit. So there are 2 marks here, so we need 2 points. The first one is you need to talk about the alpha radiation. So the alpha radiation ionizes their air particles. They split into their positive and negative ions. That's the first mark. The second mark is you've got to say the ions are attracted to the oppositely charged metal plates. And if they go to the oppositely charged plates, you can enable a current to flow around that circuit. Question 6. Explain how the alarm above can be used to detect smoke. So again, 2 marks here, so you need 2 points. So firstly, the smoke particles go into the smoke detector and are hit by alpha radiation. You need to say something about smoke particles going between those plates for the first mark. The second mark is what happens then. So you need to say that this reduces the amount of air that can be ionized, so the current will drop. You need to say something about the current dropping. And as soon as the current drops, the buzzer will sound in the smoke alarm. Question 7. Describe why the smoke alarm is not dangerous even though it contains ionizing radiation. Now this is 3 marks, so it's slightly trickier. So try and get 3 points down whenever you got a 3-mark question. The first one I've put down is that alpha radiation is not very penetrating, and it can be stopped by a few centimeters of air or paper. So the first thing is saying that alpha, even though it's dangerous and very ionizing, is not penetrating. Penetrating is a really good word to use. The second mark is that the radiation is kept in a plastic case. This is really important because the third mark, you've got to say why that's important. The radiation cannot go through that plastic case and not reach my living cells, and therefore it can't ionize them, and it couldn't cause cancer. So you need to say something on the lines of these three. They don't need to be exactly right, but you need to say something about the plastic case stopping the radiation going through. Question 8. Suggest what would happen to the smoke alarm if I placed it in a vacuum. So this is a hypothetical question. I know the buzzer would not work, so it would be useless anyway. But if it was placed in a vacuum and there was some smoke in there, just imagine, could it work? The answer is no, it wouldn't, because there is no air in the vacuum. And because there's no air in a vacuum, this means that no current would flow because the air could not be ionized. And if the current could not flow, then the buzzer would continuously try to sound. So I know this can't be done, but just imagine it could be done. Then the air would not be ionized in between those two plates on the diagram, and therefore the current wouldn't flow, and therefore it wouldn't work. It would never work, even if there was some smoke there. It would just be continuously on. The next section is on sterilization. Now this could be sterilizing food, it could be sterilizing equipment, or anything that you want to kill bugs on. The thing is with radiation is it kills anything if you have a high enough dose, but it won't damage any of the equipment or the food if it's not living. Question 9. State the type of radiation that would be used to sterilize the beakers and to test tubes of a lab worker of a hospital, and explain how the radiation is used. So again, you've got 3 marks here, so you need to say 3 points. The first one I would say is gamma would be used. You would get a mark for saying gamma is the most likely. And that is because it's very, very penetrating. It will go through all of the equipment you have. So that's 2 marks straight away by just saying gamma, and it's very penetrating. You've got to then say, why is that useful? And that's useful because anything that's living, so all the bacteria, all the viruses, all of the stuff you don't want on there, would just be destroyed because those are living cells. Ideally, you've got to use the word ionize the living cells, because that's a really, really important word. Question 10. What type of radiation would not be suitable? Alpha would not be suitable for this, and that's because it couldn't penetrate the equipment. If you had some detailed equipment that had grooves and gaps or folds, it wouldn't be able to go through. And that's a problem because the alpha couldn't get to everywhere it needs to. So alpha, because it's not penetrating, is not suitable. Question 11. Any product that needs to be irradiated is first sealed in the air before they are irradiated. Explain why. So once you've killed all the bugs, if you've got it in an unclean environment, they're just going to get all bacteria covered again. So what you do is you seal it in a bag first, and then blast the whole bag. And anything in that bag, all the bacteria, anything that's in the air, will all be killed, and then it's safely stored in a bag. That's the first thing that's really, really important. The radiation can steal all the bacteria while it's in the bag. Another reason, if you really wanted to, you could explain that once it's in the bag, it's also extra protection against contamination. But we'll talk about that in the next question. Question 12. The symbol above shows that food has been irradiated. You can normally find this on loads of food, mostly herbs and spices, things like that. You irradiate them, and that kills anything that's inside that jar or packet. Should the public be concerned that the food is now radioactive? They should not be concerned. This is because if it's irradiated, then it's not radioactive. The only reason is if it was radioactive is if it got contaminated. So food is stored in a sealed bag to prevent this contamination. Now there's really two important words in this question. One is irradiation and one is contamination. Irradiation is when you get a radioactive source and the radiation is radiated onto the food or onto a thing. That means it's been irradiated, it's been covered in radiation. However, contaminated means there's parts of that radioactive source in the food that you're talking about. So for example, if I had a radioactive source and a tiny bit of it got into the food, that means it's contaminated. But as long as it's on the outside of a jar and it covers it in radiation, that's irradiated and that's absolutely fine. That's not radioactive. It's very important that they can guarantee no food would get into the food, the food product. No radiation would get into the food, because if that got inside you, then there'd be huge problems. The next section is on paper thickness. It can be anything. I've put two diagrams of one of paper and one of foil, but they work in a very similar way. What happens is they get a radioactive source and shine it or irradiate it through the paper, and the Geiger-Müller tube on the other side will detect it. Now, the thicker the paper, the less radiation can get through it, and therefore you can tell exactly how thick the paper is by seeing how much radiation goes through it. And then you can control your rollers by going thicker or thinner to make the paper thicker or thinner. Question 13. Explain how the signal at the detector varies when the thickness of the paper is increased. So when the thickness is increased, the signal is decreased. You normally get a mark for saying a very simple fact like that. The second part is saying why. This is because the thicker paper will absorb more radiation, so less will get through. Question 14. Why could alpha radiation be unsuitable for this? Alpha cannot go through the paper or foil. It's not very penetrating. Gamma would not really be affected. It's going to go through anyway, so you wouldn't really tell the difference between thick or thin paper. That's why beta is perfect. It does go through, but it's just less. You can detect less radiation if the paper is thicker. And then you can control your rollers depending on how thick you want the paper. Question 15. What will the machine do if the signal detected is too high? You've got to say a simple fact at the start. A signal too high means the paper's very thin. Lots of radiation can get through. And then the rollers will be further apart, because if it's too thin, they need to make the paper slightly thicker, so therefore you move the rollers apart and the paper becomes very slightly thicker. The last section is on tracers. So tracers are used in the medical industry. You get them in hospitals and they're used all the time. They're really useful. Question 16. What's the main purpose of a tracer when used within the body? And why? Explain how they're used in this way. So they're mainly used for medical imaging, for seeing inside the body. The second thing you need to say is that some damaged parts of the body will have certain chemicals attracted to them. So for example, let's just say one of my kidneys is not working properly. Then if I drank some water that had a tracer in it, then all of the tracer would travel through the kidney after it's filtered through my working kidney, and I would detect a tracer through that working kidney. However, the other kidney that's damaged is not working, so therefore there would be no tracer in it. So all I would need to do is hold up the Geiger-Müller tube to my kidneys on the outside of my body, and I could see clearly which kidney is working. And that's just one very simple way that they're used. Another way they could be used is they can be placed in certain parts of the body that you need to see is maybe blocked. And then you could see, for example, the intestines, you could see certain radioactive traces going through parts of one intestine and then getting blocked. And another way, there are lots of ways, but just one other way, is they can be attracted to certain types of cancer, for example. And that means you could detect where they are and also kill them sometimes if you need to in certain areas. But that's not really a tracer, that's something slightly different. Question 17. You would want the tracer to have a short half-life. So half-life is the time it takes for the activity to decrease by half. And you want it to be very short, so it's decayed before it's done much damage. Once it goes into your body, it won't be radioactive for very long, and therefore it won't do much damage. Question 18. Why are the tracers placed inside the body even though there is a risk? There is a risk. However, you must say the benefits outweigh the risk. If you're damaged kidneys and there's not many ways to detect which kidney is damaged, then this detects it perfectly. But it only has a short half-life, which means it's not that dangerous. There are always risks, it's just not that dangerous. Question 19. Is the tracer poisonous for the human? No, they're not poisonous for the human. That's why you can take them. They normally pass straight through within a few hours or a few days, so they're not that dangerous. And question 20, what type of radiation is not used for a tracer? Now this is 3 marks, and this will be a very high level question because it's quite tricky. The first thing you've got to say is alpha radiation is not used. Then you've got to say why that's not used. So alpha is not very penetrating, so would not pass out the body. You wouldn't be able to detect it on the outside, and that's a problem. That's the first problem. The second problem is it's more likely to get absorbed by the cells in the body. It's more likely to ionize the cells, and that's a real problem because that is what could cause cancer. That's the end of the worksheet. If you still have any questions, don't forget you can ask me or use the question asker at any time.